So I was for 21 years the regional ecologist for the Forest Service Pacific Southwest region, which is California, Hawaii, and the Pacific territories, and worked with a staff of ecologists, including one stationed on the Six Rivers and another on the Klamath for that period in supporting management and science support to management in the California National Forests. And one unavoidably managing California National Forests comes face to face with ultramafic rocks and the things that grow on them and the things that wash off of them and the things that blow off of them in the wind. And I am a geologist actually originally by training, although my PhD is in ecology. And ultramafic soils, what we colloquially call serpentine or serpentine soils, are probably the best example in the world of the very strong control that geology and geologic substrate can have on the natural world. And for me, it was one of the main reasons I got really interested in ecology was because it sort of represents the meeting place between the biological and the geological spheres. So this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I will say that it's been a while since I've given a talk on serpentine ecology. It used to be very important in both my research and my professional life. And then the state of California started to burn down, as you all know, and I pivoted a little bit. And working for the Forest Service had really no choice but to become an expert in fire as well. And so that seems to be pretty much whatever is burning my bridges these days is fire. And I really, really enjoy getting back to geoecological questions. So yeah, just to repeat what Justin noted, as I go through my presentation, and I probably have got 40 or 45 minutes worth of stuff, I don't know, could be less, could be more. If you have a question that you're really keen to ask at a given time, go ahead and do it. And hopefully you know how to raise your hand. If you go, where is that thing again? Reactions. No, that's yeah. If you go and hit the little button that says reactions, there's a little raise your hand thing when you click on that. And if you just put that up, then I'll see it and I'll click on you right away. Now, if your question can wait to the end, that's fine. We can wait to the end as well. Or you can also type it in the chat and Justin can read it or I can read it. But I just know that sometimes questions are pretty tied to time and to space and the thing that's on the screen. And I'm happy to answer the questions as they come up. So let's see. I'm going to share my screen. See if I can find the thing. Sorry, I have a lot of presentations up right now. All right. So what I'm going to do, okay. Let's see if, well, hold on. This is going to take me a second. All right, we'll do it this way then. No narrations. Okay, let's go. Okay, I'm assuming. Can you tell me, Justin, are you seeing my slideshow actually now, or are you seeing my my notes?
I'm seeing your slideshow.
Okay, very good, fantastic. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to present. I might show a slideshow, a couple of presentations, and I'm going to jump over to a couple of publications at the same time. So although the title of my talk was somewhat different from this, essentially what I'm going to be talking about is taxonomic and geographic patterns and the serpentine endemic flora, but since I'm a geologist, I have a lot of interest in, and I think hopefully you will too, in the basic geological processes and patterns that underlie this fascinating part of the California flora. So there are about 6,000 square kilometers of ultramafic substrates in California. That's about 1.5% of the state area, and it's about 2.5% of the lands that are managed by the Forest Service in California. But a statistic, I think, which gives one a very quick idea of the ecological and botanical and biological importance of serpentine soils. More than 30% of all of the plant species that the Forest Service manages as quote unquote sensitive, which includes endangered, threatened, federal and state, plus other watch list species that are listed by California Native Plant Society, are essentially restricted to serpentine substrates. And that's in Northwest California. So it gives you an idea that even though it's only a few percent of the state, that a surprising number of the state's important plant species grow on this substrate. And I will give another example of that, or a couple more coming up. And sorry, one thing I should note, I got a big old canker sore in my lower lip from biting it a little while ago. So it's actually a little hard to speak. Forgive me, my voice may sound a little bit choked, and that's because it is. These are actually the serpentine outcrops in the state. Obviously, all the little ones are missing, and your favorite outcrop along the coast may be missing in this map, because this isn't going to pick up anything that's less than, probably a mile square or something like that. So in general, I've been working, and I continue to do work. We recently published a paper summarizing the diversity of endemic species to serpentine in California, and I'll refer back to that paper here in just a little bit. But we've been using it at UC Davis and in other places. There are quite a lot of people who work in the ecology of ultramafic rocks. Probably most important among them is Susan Harrison, whose office is right next to mine at UC Davis, and who was an important mentor for me 25 years ago. But we use serpentine as a model system because the substrate is so toxic and so inimical to normal biological processes that it's what we would call low productivity, and it doesn't support a whole lot of biological growth. So it provides us this great natural experimental system to understand how very low productivity substrates compare to high productivity or really fertile soils, if you will, in terms of how ecosystems respond to things like disturbances. So, for example, we've studied grazing, we've studied fire, we've studied logging, we've studied, et cetera. We've also looked at the relationships between the diversity of common and rare species in a locale, say in an area that you're standing and you can draw you use a plot to sample, versus the region. We've studied some of the stuff related to the theory of island biogeography. I'm not going to get into that. Invasion ecology, i.e. invasive species, they're much less common typically on serpentine substrates, although certain taxa are very common there, and it's important for us to understand why that is. And also, what is the relationship between productivity of the soil, and in other words, fertility, I guess would be a word you might understand more readily, and the diversity of plants on it. And then in terms of its own sake, we've got a lot of interest in understanding, what goes on this soil type, because it is so strange. And I'm going to spend some time here in a little bit talking about why it's strange and what that actually leads to. But it supports a lot of rare species, and a lot of your favorite plants and mine grow on serpentine, and sometimes only on serpentine. And so conservation issues are always really important on these places as well. All right, so let's start with ultramafic rocks. So as I noted, the term serpentine is a colloquialism, right? It's a nickname that people just use. It comes from serpentinite, and serpentinite is the name of a rock type. And it's named that because the people who named it thought that the color of the rock reminded them of the color of a serpent. So the proper geological name for serpentinite and the other rocks that it's related to, serpentine and the other rocks related to it, are ultramafic rocks. And I'll explain that. I guess I've got a couple of graphics I can show you. So mafic is a geological term that is composed of magnesium and ferric. Magnesium, ferric refers to iron. And so mafic rocks are rocks that have really high proportions of iron and magnesium minerals in them. They tend to be dark and they tend to be very heavy. Ultramafic rocks are ones that are almost only composed of mafic minerals, magnesium and iron silicates. So by definition, an ultramafic rock is an igneous or a metamorphic rock. In other words, it's a rock that either crystallized underground or was created by heating of another rock that's less than 45% free silica, and or greater than 90% of the minerals in it are what we call mafic minerals. And so some good examples are, and all of which, if you know anything about geology in Northwestern California or botany, or if you've traveled at all, or if you're into plant conservation, you'll know these terms. The most common ones in California are peridotite and serpentinite. And peridotite is the parent rock. And I'm going to explain where peridotite comes from. But when you add water and different levels of heat to peridotite, over long periods of time, it creates a metamorphic. Peridotite is igneous. It's like a granite, but a different composition because it crystallizes underground. It comes from a lava. And then serpentinite is a metamorphic byproduct of that when you add water and a certain level of heat, you create this very different looking rock, but which chemically is very, very similar. And that's called serpentinite. And like I said, if you have questions, please ask them. So igneous rocks, in other words, rocks that are lavas but that crystallize underground, the kind of things that are underneath volcanoes, for example. Like there's a magma chamber underneath Mammoth Lakes. There's a big one, or a bunch of them, under Yellowstone National Park, right, in which there's liquid or semi-liquid rock down there. If that stuff crystallizes underground, it will be called an igneous rock. If it comes out of the ground as a lava, it will be called a volcanic rock. So this is a graphic just giving you an idea of the differences among things of granites, diorites, gabbros, and periddotites in their chemical composition. So a lot of people will refer to all igneous rocks as granites or granitic, but they're not. Granite is what we call a felsic rock, and felsic means iron and silica. So it's a rock that's very high in silica. Diorite and gabbro are, you've probably heard of basalt. Basalt is the same thing as gabbro, except basalt came out as a lava and gabbro crystallized underground. These are what we call mafic. And then peridotite is ultramafic. And here it gives you an idea. SiO2 is silica. So this is the stuff that makes the glass in your windows. And this is what composes the quartz on beaches, for example. So you can see that granites are over 70% free silica, whereas ultramafic rocks like peridotite are less than half free silica. You can see that the aluminosilicates are very high in felsic and mafic rocks, very low in ultramafic rocks. And you see that iron, and in particular magnesium, are extremely high. These are magnesium oxides and iron oxides in peridotites. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the chemical composition of granitic rocks, diorites, and peridotites are very, very different. And it has a very, very important influence on what can grow on these rocks. So next question. Where do these things come from? Well, so the unique thing about ultramafic rocks really is that they're rare on the surface. They're not rare in the earth. And in fact, they're extremely common in the earth. And when I say in the earth, if you could cut the earth with a chainsaw or with a knife and kind of split it open, you'd see that the entire mantle of the earth, which is found below the upper crust, is composed of ultramafic rocks. However, the mantle does not show up at the surface of the earth very often at all, and it usually does so really by accident. So ultramafic rocks are, again, they're really common in the earth, but they're not common on the surface much. And as a result of that, their particular and unique chemical composition is something that plants and animals have not had a lot of opportunity to adapt to because they're not very, very common. Evolution can find a way. You can throw whatever you want at the earth, and if you give it a few million years, things are going to adapt to it, right? So that's really what's driving the uniqueness of these substrates, is that its chemical composition is rare at the surface, and hence a lot of critters and plants can't deal with it. And I'll talk a little bit here in a second about some of the minerals that are found in ultramafic rocks that make them so unique. But basically what happens is ultramafic rocks are found here at the mantle, and the way they get to the surface in most places is when those tectonic plates that are wandering around on the surface crash into one another, and what we call active margins. So for example, the west coast of the United States, once you get north of about where you folks are, actually, there's still subduction happening, right? And this is why you have earthquakes. There's an oceanic plate, and in this case, it's the Juan de Fuca plate, that's being subducted between underneath the North American plate. And that's a very sticky, messy process in which an absolutely gigantic film on the surface of the earth is going underneath another film. And as that happens, the mantle of the earth melts. And then as it gets pushed down further into the lithosphere, and it rises like a lava lamp, and it makes chains of volcanoes. And you can see them: Mount Shasta, Mount Lassen, Mount McLaughlin, right? The Three Sisters, Mount Hood, Mount Rainier, Mount Adams. You go all the way up into Alaska. So that whole ring of fire around the Pacific is a ring of volcanoes that are created by this active subduction of oceanic crust by continental crust. And I'll just note real briefly that when continents are interacting with oceanic plates, the oceanic plate is almost always the plate that goes under the continental plate to be subducted, because it's composed of ferromagnesian minerals. It's mafic and ultramafic, and they're heavier. So they're denser. It's just like, a really dense thing and a really light thing. The light thing is going to float on top of the dense thing. Anyway, so here's a cross section. All right, so usually when we find, so peridotite is the ultramafic rock. This is the parent of serpentinite. Gabbro is, and these sheeted dikes, these are basalts and gabbros. And then above those are pillow lavas. And so what happens in the oceanic crust is that, I should go back just for a second. Here at mid-ocean spreading centers, there's a whole lot of, since this lower lithosphere is it's what we would call fluid. It's viscous, but it can move. Like I said, it's a lot like a lava lamp. As it gets heated, it rises in the center of the ocean basins along these mountain ranges that we call the mid-ocean ridges, or the mid-ocean spreading centers. And this is where oceanic crust is created, and it's slowly pushed apart as this lava comes to the surface. And this is what drives these conveyor belts of plates that are moving around on the planet's surface. This rock here leads to what we call these sheeted dikes that surface, spew out under the ocean, and then they create what we call pillow lavas. And there are pillow lavas all over your part of the world. There are a surprising number of mountains, for example, in the North Coast ranges that are stranded islands from the Pacific that were created by piles of lava that were extruded under the water, making these strange sort of pillow or bubble-like shapes. If you've ever seen the videos of lava coming out from, for example, the volcanoes in Hawaii underwater, you'll see how that's formed. They sort of they spew out, and then they get cold right away. They make these sort of pillow-like things, and then they'll break open and spew out, etc. Anyway, so when you run into this package of rock, and we see these all over California, where you've got peridotites and gabbros and basalts, and then sediments on top of them, we call that an ophiolite. And the funny thing is that the so serpentinite is the from the Latin root for snake. Ophios was the Greek root for snake. And so whoever decided to name these packages of peridotite, serpentinite, and these other things also decided to use someone else's name for snake. But these packages of rock are found all over on the planet Earth. And I don't really have time to go into the history of this, but the geological history of the importance of these ophiolitic packages is really interesting, because back in the 1960s and 70s, after the end of the Second World War, when lots of drilling was going on in the oceanic crust for a variety of reasons, some purely scientific, some looking for oil, etc., was when they would pull their cores out of oceanic crust out in the middle of the Pacific or the Atlantic, they'd get a core that would have this whole sequence of rock. And the bottom of it would be these really dense, heavy, dark peridotites, and then there would be gabbros and basalts, pillow lavas, and then there'd be sediments, and sometimes a lot of chert on the top. And so people came to realize through these cores that, oh, this is the way the oceanic crust is, and its overlying rocks are structured. Oh, that's really interesting. Well, give it a little bit of time, and some smart young geologists walking around in Cyprus and in Crete and in places like that started to recognize that they were mapping rock sequences that looked exactly like what people were seeing in cores from the oceanic plates out in the middle of the oceans, but didn't make any sense because these packages of rock were found on the tops of mountains. For example, in the Mount Olympus on Cyprus at nearly 7,000 feet, there's exactly this sequence of rock. And it took a couple of really smart people, including Eldridge Moores, who ended up becoming faculty at UC Davis, to recognize in the 1960s, in late 50s and 60s, that the Earth was a lot more dynamic than we thought, and that clearly oceanic rock was finding its way to high elevations on the continents. And this was one of the really important pieces of evidence for the fact that the Earth's surface was actually very dynamic, and things were moving all over the place and going up and down and right and left. Let's see, I was going to show, yeah, okay, so this is a geological map of California. I just quickly stole this. This is the old generalized map that you can purchase from, you could purchase from the California Department of Conservation for a while. But what I wanted to note here was that if you look at the general geology of California, there are a couple of patterns that are really worth thinking about. First of all, is this area that's all red with a lot of light blue and dark sort of purplish rock in it. This is the Sierra Nevada in general. These are the Southern Cascades and the Modoc Plateau. And this rock type with this hachured red, these are all volcanic rocks. So this is lava. And then the red rock, these are all batholithic rocks, or what you would call granitic rocks. So the roots of ancient volcanoes, right, which have been exhumed through and raised up and then exhumed through erosion. The blue rocks are either ancient sedimentary rocks or metamorphic rocks that were sediments. And then these purple things, these are serpentinites or ultramafic rocks. And you can see them, they're similar to the map I showed earlier. And there are some huge areas of them in the Klamath Mountains, some of the biggest areas in all of North America. This is the Trinity ophiolite, and this is the Josephine ophiolite, which goes well into Oregon. And then what you'll notice, and which is interesting, is that this is the Klamath Mountains, and you guys are out here, right? And you can see that this looks really similar to the Sierra Nevada. And indeed, what happened was that all of these rocks were emplaced during subduction of the Juan de Fuca plate off here, starting about 200 million years ago. And so the age of all these rocks, in terms of when they crystallized, is between mostly about 220 and, I don't know, 140, 150 million years, something like that. And at that point, the Klamath Mountains were the northern head of the Sierra Nevada. They were over here. And about 130 million years ago, over the course of a few million years, the fault structure that goes off here off of Cape Mendocino, this whole part of California moved 60 miles off to the west over a long period of time. And this is tied to, large fault structures, a San Andreas fault kind of movement. And so it's not a coincidence that it looks just like the Northern Sierra Nevada. It is the Northern Sierra Nevada. And then the San Andreas fault comes up here. And this is the Pacific plate out here and the North American plate over here. And then you folks are here, and you're in a kind of a light green mess of rock that we call the Franciscan assemblage. That is, if the people who tried to invent geology had tried to do it in California, they would have failed utterly, because the Franciscan rocks are just like a bunch of toothpaste and dust and old socks all mixed up in a washing machine and thrown out onto the surface of the earth. It's an absolute mess. And there's a lot of ultramafic rock caught in here. A lot of times it might be no bigger than your backyard. All of this material that you see in California, all the way here from Southern California north up this way, down to about a line more or less in here, is all the product of subduction over and addition of sediments onto the edge of the continent. And I'll explain that in just a second. I'm not going to go into this. That's a little bit too complex. So here is something I had a little hand-drawn map I did a few years ago, so I just took a photo of it rather than trying to redraw it. One of the things you need to understand is that the Earth's surface is really dynamic, and we know from coring and from geological investigation that about 400 million years ago, the edge of North America was out here. It was in western Utah, eastern Nevada, and western Idaho. And then over time, as rivers deposited sediment off the coast, and then this added to the continent. And then starting about 200 million years ago, the North American, this is when the Atlantic Ocean began to open, and the North American plate started to move to the west, and it started to override the Juan de Fuca plate. So this whole area here is material added to the edge of the continent during subduction. So here's the coast 200 million years ago. Here it is 150 million years ago. This is as we can best reconstruct it, about 80 million years ago, and obviously it's here at this point. But so if you can picture subduction, I think the best way to understand how it functions is a way that Eldridge Moore has actually explained to me. And so I've stolen this. I didn't make this up, but I think it's a great example. Go in your kitchen, close the door out into the dining room or the living room. Take yourself a frozen pizza, heat it up so it's pretty gooey. Put a lot of toppings on top of it first, and then close the door from the kitchen out into the dining room and try to force the pizza under the door. And as you're forcing that pizza under the door, what'll happen is the crust of the pizza, which is unfortunately named because it would actually be the mantle if we're talking geology, that's going to make it, right? Unless you've got a really tight fitting door, that's going to end up over in the dining room. And that represents the portion of that crustal package that's being subducted that will melt and become volcanoes. Whereas all the stuff you put on the top of that pizza, the cheese and the tomatoes and the anchovies and the artichokes or whatever you like on your pizza, that's not going to make it past the door. That stuff's going to get stuck on the bottom of the door. So if you do 20 or 30 pizzas in a row like that, what you're going to find is after 20 or 30 pizzas, you're going to have about 1.5 feet of just like a mess of this pizza topping stuck to the bottom of the door. That's what California is. Most of California, north of Southern California is basically the accumulation of millions, tens and tens of millions of years of this pizza crust getting shoved under the edge of the continent, and all that goo at the top being sheared off and sticking to the edge of the continent, making it broader and broader and broader. And the term that geologists use for this is allochthonous terrain, or terrains that came from other places. And so some of the better examples, for example, in your area, Red Mountain down by Leggett, or Snow Mountain, which is, southeast of Covelo and kind of out towards the Central Valley. Those are examples of ancient seamounts, of literally islands that were off the coast that came in with the subducting oceanic plate and were scraped off and stuck onto the edge of the continent. And there are a lot of examples of that kind of stuff all over on the continent. So let's talk a little bit about, okay, so that's a little bit about where serpentine soils come from, or rocks come from. They come from the mantle, they come to the surface largely where you have active tectonic subduction mostly happening at the surface. And this is why they happen in lines. You'll see around the world, they tend to be in lines, and they mark where subduction happened in the past. So in terms of what this rock generates with respect to a soil, because that's what matters to plants, you can see that the cation exchange capacity, in other words, its ability to hold cations like calcium, magnesium, et cetera, is very high. It's because there's a lot of clay, typically in serpentine soils. Organic matter is very low because the soil is very difficult to grow in, and so there's relatively little biological activity. Phosphorus is very low. In fact, phosphorus is critically low in serpentine, and plants and most organisms need phosphorus to build proteins. Calcium is extremely low as well. Calcium is very, very important to the ability to pass nutrients across cell membranes and a bunch of other stuff. Magnesium is really, really high, and nitrogen tends to be very low because nitrogen is biogenic, right? So if there's not a lot of biological productivity in the soil, you're not going to have a lot of organic matter or nitrogen. The other thing to note is that these rocks are also relatively toxic. And so let me think of, do I have a graphic on that? I may not. Yeah. So let me just note. So this is what we call lizardite. It's a type of it's a serpentine rock. And this is serpentinite that has been cooked at relatively low temperatures. So aside from the fact that these rocks are very low in potassium, in phosphorus, in calcium, and the soils are very low in nitrogen as well, all of which are absolutely necessary to be able to grow really luxuriant vegetation, except for taxa that are adapted to this. You also have got a bunch of heavy metals in this stuff. So all of the chromium, all of the nickel, all of the cobalt that we find in our water sources or that we find in mines, this stuff is really dangerous. It all comes from ultramafic rock, all of it. And so luckily, for the most part, depending on the situation, well, I wouldn't say for the most part, but it's often not biologically available as you will, because you need to methylate these things, and you have to have chromium in a certain form in order for it to be biologically, let's say, active. Another thing is that most of the major mercury deposits in California are associated with serpentine and associated hot water or hydrothermal activity around that. And asbestos is also an ultramafic mineral. So just about everything you can think of that comes out of the ground that could kill you is associated with ultramafic rocks. So what do we find? So if we look at grasslands that are growing on serpentine rocks versus neighboring grasslands growing on more fertile soils, you can see that this is just from a bunch of studies we've done. So these are some averages. You can see that biomass is, 40% of what grows on the neighboring fertile soil. In other words, everything else is the same. It's the same, facing the same direction, same elevation. It's getting the same precipitation. The cover is much lower. Obviously, you can see there's a lot higher leaf area index if the biomass is so much higher. Litter cover is lower, and the amount of bare soil is oftentimes 2 to 3 times higher. In chaparral soil, chaparral vegetation, similar kind of stuff, much slower growth. In this case, less than half in terms of the growth per year. This is, I think this is growth in stem width, I believe. Much lower cover, much lower litter cover, and much higher rock cover, typically, in these systems. So here's a good example of, this is serpentine chaparral 75 years after the last fire. Here is non-serpentine chaparral 30 years after fire. And you can see how much faster plants are able to accumulate biomass and grow on sort of what we'll call regular soils, even though the soils under this chaparral site here are garbage. Here, they're really bad. I mean, this is 75 years of growth in this system. Also, because of the very open nature of serpentinite or vegetation on serpentinite or peridotite, fire severity tends to be lower because there's not as much continuity in fuels. There's much higher variety or variability in burning and burn severity. And it's much more difficult. Like if a lightning strike hits the dirt in here, it's not going to start a fire. Whereas if it hits anywhere here, you're going to see a fire. There's generally a higher and sometimes much higher ratio of native to exotic species in serpentine. And that's because it's a toxic soil. And most invasive exotic plants in California have not been exposed to serpentinites, and they don't have adaptations to be able to deal with it. So in chaparral, even though chaparral in general, as long as it hasn't been burned very frequently, doesn't support a lot of non-native species, there are higher ratios of natives to non-natives on serpentinites. Grasslands are much more native dominated. And these were actually, I think, all in grazed grasslands, but at high distances from roads, whereas along roadsides, obviously the what would you call it, the pressure, the invasive pressure is much higher in roadside grasslands, and so the difference isn't quite as high. And also next to roads, you have a whole lot of nitrogen inputs, which help to ameliorate how bad the soil is. Very, very high rates of endemism in these places. So these are the means from, we sampled dozens and dozens of plots over a number of years in a bunch of places in the Klamath, the north coast of the Sierra Nevada, and the south coast. And you can see that in the north coast of the Klamath, within any plot that we sampled, anywhere between 10 and 20%, say, of the species we sampled were endemic to serpentine. Sierra Nevada was much lower. And I can explain that later on. If anyone has a question on that, ask me and I can explain why we think that is. And the south coast is also lower. And you can also see that except for this one outlier here, that in general, you see more endemics, the nastier the soil is. We've done some other work since then. It does seem to be there may be a little hump in here. But basically, this does not only have to do with the fact that it leads to evolutionary pressures on species, that if they're going to be able to live in really toxic. So in other words, what this is this is the ratio of magnesium to calcium, okay? And so that the higher magnesium ratios that you've got, in other words, we've inverted it. So the more magnesium compared to calcium, the more toxic the soil is to most plants, and it's very difficult to grow on them. The more endemics you have, so there's been more evolutionary pressure for species that can deal with this. But at the same time, it means that there's less competition from fast-growing species that are dominating very fertile systems. So I'm just going to cover some of the work that we've done with serpentine diversity. Let me check my time here. Okay. This was what was available in 1984. Art Kuckerberg's classic California Serpentines book. He was the only one to study diversity on those. And it was very qualitative, basically based on his work walking around California. And he was a big walker and spending time in the herbaria. This is Art. I got to know Art pretty well. This is 2003 at a meeting in Cuba that we were at an international serpentine ecology meeting. Art sadly died 6 or 7 years ago. He was a tremendous individual. But in 2000, there was a lot more information available, a lot of floras. There was the Jepson, the first volume of the Jepson Manual, and a lot of books on particularly from Northern California, on local floras. And this is when about 2000, late 90s, is when the beginning of sort of the online revolution happened for botanical information, and we started to be able to actually search herbaria remotely, which was extraordinary. Anyway, I'm gonna go through this real quick. So that allowed us to do an update to Art's work. And now in 2020, now you've got the Jepson eFlora, which basically is 10 times better than all of those other websites combined. I mean, basically everything we want to know, we don't even have to go into the herbarium anymore. You can just get online, type in a name, you can get all the accession records for everything in the system, where they were, what they were identified as, what soils they were on, all that stuff. And obviously in the eFlora, it's updated so commonly that all the new taxonomy is in this stuff as well. And then, there's the CalFlora website. CNPS has its own website. So anyway, why did we update Kruckenberg's list? Well, when we first did it, they were 20 years old. And then we decided we were going to do it again because they were 40 years old. If you know anything about botany, you'll know that it's aggravating because there's so much genetic work going on now that it's just absolutely turning the taxonomic world on its head. And it's actually getting to the point now where it's very difficult to keep up with the changes because they're just literally happening under your nose. There are a lot of new technologies and data sources. And earlier, from the earlier presentation, I said, hey, they were updating the California flora in 2000 they were starting work on volume 2 of the Jepson manual, which finally came out in, I don't know, what was that, 2016, something like that. Well, that's already way out of date. And so now it's literally constantly being updated because it's all online. There's a lot of missing information and a lot of the botanical information at the herbaria. A lot of botanists know nothing about geology. So it was important that we get a real feeling for the actual how endemic some of these species were. And a lot of information on conservation. A lot of what we know about conservation of these species depends on our knowing to what extent they're restricted to these. Okay, I'm not going to go through the methods here. So we published in 2005 California Serpentine endemism database. It's been cited nearly 300 times in the scientific literature. It's been used. It ended up as part of the CalFlora website, et cetera. However, between 2005 and when the new Jepson came out in 2016, there were just an unbelievable number of changes and a surprising number of new species. So we set about doing it again. 15 years later, we just published in 2020 an update to this. Don't use the old publication. Please use the new one. It's Madronio. It's easy to find. Here's the citation. And what it has, it provides information on the levels of serpentine endemism in the California flora, levels of rarity among that flora, what are the distributions of those taxa. It's the newest information on taxonomy, although obviously for some of the groups that'll already be out of date. Has information on life forms and biogeography and other things as well. This is an example of the appendix, the paper. It's probably 7 or 8, 9 pages of text actually, and then a very long appendix that has the actual list. And so basically it starts here by family, then by taxon within each family. And so we've got everything down to varieties, subspecies, and species. We have a measure of the affinity, which is it a strict endemic? That is more than 95% of its occurrences are only on serpentine. A broad endemic, I think, was more than 85%. Broad endemic, strong indicator, a weak indicator, or a species that's indifferent. We only include species here that we have previous information that suggests to us and to other experts that it has some association with serpentine. Then we looked across, you can look at the original 2005 paper if you want the background on this, but we are accessing, in some cases, dozens of sources. Like here's the number of sources for our rating. Like this species, we found nine resources, including information in the herbaria. And so this gives you a ranking, the median, how many sources were from the standard deviation. It tells you California Native Plant Society's rarity ranking. It tells you which parts of the state it's found in. It tells you the life form of the taxon as well. And I guess that's all that's actually in this. So this is some of the information. So what you see is that where you folks live, which is, well, I guess some of you are in the Calamus and some are in the North Coast, but that part of California obviously is the center of endemic diversity on serpentine soils in California. The Klamath have the highest number of strict endemics, or what I call here regional endemics, that are only found in the Klamath. But the North Coast has the highest number of total endemics. Together, I think they host more than half of all the serpentine endemics in California. You can see the Sierra Nevada is low. And again, I can explain that if people have interest in that, but I won't do it now. This is comparing some of the places in the world that have the most well-known serpentine substrates and the most interesting serpentine rarities in the flora. You can see that New Caledonia is by far that's an island northeast of it's between New Guinea and Australia, off to the northeast of Australia and north of New Zealand, and was a French possession. And New Caledonia is almost entirely peridotite and serpentinite, almost the entire island, and nearly almost half of the flora on the island are serpentine endemics. It's amazing. Cuba is extremely high. It and California both are 14.7% of the endemics in the state are on serpentines. And you think about that I told you that, what was it, 1.5% of the California surface area is on serpentine, yet almost 15% of the endemic species in California are found only on serpentine, or almost only on serpentine, which is extraordinary. It shows you it's by far the most important source of endemics in the state. Balkans and Greece, Italy and Spain, notably fewer endemics. So this is information from the most recent update. And you can see that these first 8 families account for 50, I think there are 10 here, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I guess I only put 9. Or no, there are 10. But the first 8 are more than 50% of the endemics. The highest ones are the margaritas, the daisy family, sunflower family, then the mustards, then Polygonaceae, then the lilies. Well, this is this is from, I guess actually this is from the original 2000, and this is from our work before 2016, because the lily family's been absolutely destroyed by taxonomists. It barely exists anymore. Polemoniaceae, and then Orobanchaceae actually is a lot of species from the old Scrophulariaceae went into Orobanchaceae. This is the broom, broomrape family. These are the carrots, Apiaceae, flax, Dudleas, and sedums, and the blueberry family. And then this is from the 2011 data. Forgive me, I didn't have time to update this to 2020. But basically, what I wanted to note is that there are certain families in here that are really overrepresented in the serpentine flora. And I don't think that enough science has been done on this. Like, why is that? What is going on genetically or evolutionarily in these particular groups that leads them to be able to have so many taxa that can survive on ultramafic substrates? Again, I just want to note that I have a couple arrows on Scrophulariaceae and Liliaceae because those families got absolutely wiped out in the most recent taxonomy. And so those families are not in this list anymore, but rather there are some families that came from them that are. So this is from the 2011 work that we did. But you can see that a lot of those families and the carrots and the flaxes, et cetera, are overrepresented in the serpentine flora. Some are under, like there are fewer scrophs in the broad sense. Fabaceae, those are the legumes. And a lot of these ones down here where there are fewer of these than there are in the state endemics. And then some which seem to be more or less proportional. Anyway, nothing I'll ever study in my life, but for those people who are interested in evolutionary adaptation and stuff, that might be something worth looking at. Here are the genera that have the most endemic species, and you can see that there are a few that are most of them. And the most important one is Striptanthus, which is in the mustard family. Jewel flower is what it's called. And there are a lot of endemic jewel flowers on serpentines. Also Eriogonum, which is buckwheats, right? Hesperolinen, which is a California member of the flax family. Arctostaphylos, which is manzanita, of course. Allium is onion. Lomatium, which is from the carrot family, etc. Anyway, all this information is available in these different papers. And then in terms of life forms, most of them are perennial forbs, almost 60%. And then between annual forbs and perennial forbs, that's almost 90% of all of them. This got cut off, but this is grasses, perennial, and I don't think there are any annual grasses. I think they're just perennial grasses, and then shrubs and trees. And of those, 80% or more than 80% are dicots, 15% monocots, and a very small number are ferns and gymnosperms, which include conifers. In terms of distribution of the taxa by elevation, it's not really different in terms of all of the California flora. It's pretty much mostly found, in the lower 1,000 meters up to about 3,000 feet or so, and above that, and the number of taxa drops a lot. And that's basically because as you get higher in elevation, you have smaller land masses. Geographic distribution in terms of total endemics, restricted endemics. It just gives you an idea that how badly we needed to update Art Kruckerberg's data from the 1980s. The number of taxa that have been described since the 80s in California, it's actually astounding. And you would think that, that a place like California, which has had so much botanizing done on it for so long, that there wouldn't be anything new to find. But I'm telling you, every couple of years, someone describes another species endemic to serpentine somewhere in California. It's really amazing. But those numbers just keep going up and keep going up. I'm not going to cover that. That's a little bit too esoteric for the time we have. But then in terms of rarity, this is from the 11 data. So my point is that it was the more recent work we did, there are going to be slight changes here. But basically, 11% of the California plant taxa that are rated 1B, right, which is, you know, what is the 1B again? That's the endangered and threatened, right? They're serpentine endemics, which is incredible when you think about it. All right, so what I thought I'd do, how am I doing, Justin? You guys need me to stop? I can, I was going to just show some pictures and some sites if people want to see.
Keep on going.
Okay. So this is from the McLaughlin Reserve. That's one of the University of California ecological reserves. It's on the borders of Lake Yolo and Sonoma counties, or near the border of those. And this is one of the most important places for endemism in the state. And these numbers, basically, this is a broad endemic. SE is a strict endemic. This is just an indicator, but it gives you an idea that this area is very fascinating because it has a lot of woody species that are endemic to serpentinite, as well as a lot of forbs as well. Here's some other examples. This is Ring Mountain, close to, that's in the West Bay, north of San Francisco. Really interesting area. Hesperolina congestum grows out here. This is up in on the Josephine ophiolite, Smith River, up in the botanical area, the Smith River. This area here is sort of this open, you know, mixed conifer, and it's not much in the way of hardwoods because most hardwoods don't survive on ultramafic rocks. But this place gets, you know, 2,000 millimeters of rain. I mean, it's incredible to think that a place that's getting that much rain can only support this kind of vegetation. And this place hadn't burned in hundreds of years. Gives you an idea of how difficult the soil is. This is Del Puerto Canyon, which is inland of Los Banos. And kind of it would be sort of directly east of San Jose, but on the where the Coast Range comes into the Central Valley. This place is threatened by the potential dam, actually, and we're really worried about it because it's an amazing geological cross-section, this canyon. Almost no human population in the canyon, and it has a lot of really important endemics. This is Lake Success down near Fresno, an area where there are literally no endemics at all on the serpentine outcrop. Sorry, it's not Cupressus anymore. Now it's Hesperocyperus, but this is Port Orford cedar, which is largely a serpentine endemic, not completely. We call it a strong indicator, yeah, so it's not an endemic, but it's often found on ultramafic outcrops. This is also common in northwestern California. In the northern Sierra, this is just above Quincy on the road over to Oroville. Monument Ridge is what this is called. This area has a lot of endemic species as well, relatively high. This is in Southern California, Santa Ana Mountains in Orange County. And there's this is the southernmost serpentine outcrop in California, except on Catalina Island. Well, let me think about that. Yeah, I think the Catalina Island outcrop is a little bit south of this. But what it is it's a highly hydrothermally altered ultramafic rock that's turned almost into a talc, like a soapstone, and it's this white thing. Very little grows on it, but knobcone pine grows all around the outside of it. It's kind of interesting. And then this is what we think is the highest serpentine outcrop in the whole state. We found it on the summit ridge of Virginia Peak. This is Yosemite Park, right in the border of Yosemite, right between Bridgeport and Mono Lake in the Virginia Lakes area. Just this little patch of ultramafic rock that had been heavily hydrothermally altered. And we found some really interesting plants on that one, but no endemics. And then here's some of my favorite plants on serpentine that I think are some of the most beautiful. This is Calochortus abispoensis, which people down there call serpentine. What do they call it? I forget the common name for it, but that's just got to be my favorite Calochortus in the whole state. And that grows on Cuesta Ridge. It's a serpentine endemic, more or less. This is Rogeraceous Calochortus, which is a more of a bell type of fairy lantern. This is found in the Cedars, which is up your way, actually, not too far from the Jackson Creek Redwoods. Asclepias solanoana. This is a very strict endemic on serpentines. It's a milkweed that grows along the ground. Just a spectacular plant. And Fritillaria falcata, which is, where's Fritillary Fulcata? I think that's also southern, our northern coast range. So I did this, last time I did this talk was in Italy. That's why I've got Grazie Mille on there. So that's what I have for y'all. And this is a piece of ultramafic rock. This is a mixture of, you can see the fibrous stuff in here. Some of this is chrysotile. There's a little bit of asbestos in this rock, actually. Anyway, let's see here. So I will stop sharing. So that's what I had for y'all. It was kind of a ramble. But if there are questions, I'd love to answer them.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it looks like you want to see, we got some questions, it seems like that are coming in the chat. Somebody was talking about the proposed dam. I don't know if there's anything more you want to say to that.
Yep, I know them, and thank you very much for passing that along to me. I know the organization, and I've actually been in touch with them. Yeah, there's a lot of the locals who live near the canyon, and the thing I think that they could, maybe you've seen the video. They did a video about the canyon, but it's focused very heavily on human history, which is really important and really fascinating in the area. But I think that they could have spent a lot more time with the really important geological and biological legacy of the canyon, and that's something that I told them. I see some hands up. Want me to just choose those folks? Okay, I see Cynthia Packard has a hand up.
Hello.
Hi.
So part of what fascinates me with this is some of the risk of serpentine soils. I love the Lassex area. And in fact, for a while, I volunteered with KS Wild to do some reports on it as a botanical area. But with the amount of asbestos there, I'm wondering if there's any precautions or things to be aware of when you're camping and driving around on dirt roads.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So the most typical kind. So first of all, I am not a certified expert with a state license to tell you things about what you should know about asbestos. You should know that. I'm a geologist, though. When I study this stuff. There are a couple different kinds of asbestos. All right. The most common in ultramafic rocks is called chrysotile asbestos, and that's what I was showing you. In fact, tell you what, while I'm answering your question, I'm just going to bring up the presentation again, and I'll show you a piece of rock that's got, let me see, I know I have a, is this it here? Yeah. Okay, let me just, am I showing my, I forgot, I think I forgot to hit share, right? Let me just share this real quickly with you again. This rock, if we go back to the top, the very top, there's a picture up here. Right there. See that fibrous there? That's chrysotile. Yeah. That stuff's really common. You're going to see that all over the place, and you probably have all the time. That chrysotile is not really an issue. Although there's a little bit of a debate on it, but it'll dissolve in acetic acid. Like you pour that stuff in vinegar, and it'll dissolve. So what the worry is when you get actinolytic fibers, which are a different kind of asbestos formed under slightly different conditions. Those don't dissolve, and that's the issue, right? Because these fibers get in your lungs, they get stuck there like a needle, and they create cancerous growths after a while. That's what you really need to worry about. So I'm not saying you shouldn't be worried, but that's what you need to look for, is like assays of what kind of asbestos is actually there. Now, I will say that the place that I'm most familiar with, there really is a major issue, is by San Benito, you guys, if you know the Central Coast Range at all, south of, Gilroy, down that way, kind of where you start getting into the drylands down there, there's a big area of ultramafic rock. In fact, it's where the state mineral comes from. Benitoite is from that same area as well. And in fact, the state rock is serpentinite too. I mean, we can't get away from this rock. It's everything. But, and the San Andreas Fault, apparently the bottom of it is all serpentinite. So anyway, the stuff is everywhere, right? And that place is documented as having problematic asbestos, and it is problematically also a really heavily used off-road vehicle recreation area. And when I was down there a lot doing work, there was a big debate over it. Like, what do we do? Do we shut this down, or we just put signs up saying you could die riding around here? And I got to be honest, I'm not sure what they decided in the end. Another one was in Tahoe. Maybe you heard this. Well, maybe in your area, this is what's happening, but on the Tahoe National Forest, one of the most important quarries they had for road gravel was in a serpentinite quarry. And they were spreading this stuff all over roads, all over the place,
Okay.
east of Nevada City and Grass Valley. And they realized, oh my God, we gotta close this quarry. So I would say that, yeah, if you want to be safe, you know, I think that you have to go look up like what they say, what you should be wearing. But I know what you're saying about the elastics, because there's a lot of powdery soil up there. And that would worry me if I were stomping around in that and the wind were blowing like hell. Yeah.
Yeah, and it worries me too when I've got the car getting full of dust and then I breathe it for the next month or two till I clean the car.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think that the fact that you're still alive and apparently healthy is probably a good sign.
The whole
But-
thing came up. One of my favorite hot springs you drive through Serpentine area to get through, and I've taken to rolling up the windows and
Yeah.
putting it on recirc.
Yep.
Because I
that's-
overheard a couple lawyers talking in the dining room about how hard it is to prosecute asbestos cases in California because there's so much background asbestos.
It's everywhere. But I was going to say, I think the standard thing is roll your windows up, put it on recirculation, maybe even wear a mask when you're driving. You know, if you're walking, I would stay away from the really powdery soils if you can help it. But if you're walking on rock, particularly on a wet day, you're not kicking anything up. There's nothing really to worry about in those cases.
Oh,
And also, you know, you should also note that this is an issue on serpentinite. A lot of the outcrops that you're going to be around are periddotites. And like, for example, Red Mountain by Leggett is largely peridotite, not completely, but largely. In other words, that's the red, you know, the dark rock that makes the really red soils. And there's usually very little asbestos in those places.
Okay.
Okay, the next one I saw up was, okay, Michael Evenson, I think, was the next.
Hi, I have a question about where we live, which is right at the mouth of the Atoll. That's at the north end of the King Range.
Mm-hmm.
We've often had trouble growing things and also raise cows and are always interested in what kinds of grasses grow. I was wondering whether, and we often just blame it on the salt in the air and the cold and the fog and all. I was wondering whether maybe there's this ultramafic rock underneath it all, which causes our difficulties. Is that possible?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So yeah, you're going to find that anything. Okay, so let me qualify something for a second. You can also have ultramafic rocks that have. So I'm going to just remind you of kind of the way this works. So peridotite is the parent rock. Okay, it's the rock that makes up the mantle of the planet. It's a kind of igneous rock. It's like a dark version of a granite. Okay, so when that gets hydrothermally altered under relatively low temperatures, but you just add water to it for a long time, it turns into serpentinite, all right? So those two rocks on their own at that point are actually, the only real difference is serpentinite has a lot of water added to it, and it might have some silica and it might have some carbonate added to it, all right, a little bit. But chemically, they're actually pretty similar, and their effects on plants are pretty similar. Plants are stunted, you don't get great biomass development, things grow slowly, a lot of bare ground, stuff like that. Now, you can also have a situation where, let's say that rock is sitting next to granites. Granites always come up as magmas. Magmas are always associated with lots of hot water. And if that hot water, and if you have other hydrothermal waters, like you're around hot springs, and that's getting into the ultramafics, sometimes that rock might be very calcium rich. And so a great example is the North Fork of the Feather River on the Plumas National Forest. And if you've never been up the canyon of the North Fork of the Feather River, it's really worth a field trip. Botanically, it is fascinating, but it goes through what's called Serpentine Canyon, this long, just miles and miles and miles of peridotite and serpentinite. And you'll see oaks on the ultramafics there, which blows our mind because oaks don't grow on typical ultramafic soils. And the reason is because it's all been hydrothermally altered with very calcium-rich water. So the soil, although it's still relatively unproductive, things can grow on it that wouldn't otherwise. So so my point, Michael, was just that when another one is soapstone. You know what soapstone is, right? Or talc, that's also an ultramafic rock. If you add a whole lot of silica through hot water to serpentinite, it becomes soapstone or talc. That also, you can find dense forest on soapstone, but there is definitely, if you want to go do some digging, and if you want to just find someone who knows their rocks, do some digging and see what you got underneath there. In fact, you could send it to me. I don't really care. I'll let you know. But anyone who knows anything about geology would be able to tell you whether that's what's going on. Sorry, that was a long answer. Cynthia Packard was, no, Starflower was the next one, actually, I think. You might be on mute, Starflower.
Oh, okay. We're trying.
Okay, oh, but your hand is up, so I'm asking you if you have a question.
Okay, you can hear us?
Yep.
Here's the question. Up on Red Mountain, close to Leggett, Piercy, etc. There are some very deep canyons that are what on the fault lines between the Serpentine block and the Franciscan blocks around.
Yeah.
Spots on those deep canyons, we get a big landslide coming off the Serpentine, mixing with a big landslide coming off the
Franciscans,
Franciscan
stuff.
stuff. I wonder if any of you guys have gone down into those spots like that and studied the mix of plants on there, because sometimes you see them come down and all of the conifer sprouts on one side of the melange mix of these two slide chunks will be all of the I'm sorry, I'm not a biologist, I'm an anthropologist. I try to remember all these things, but there'll be the cypresses and the pines that all grow on Red Mountain.
Okay.
And on another side, they will all be the Douglas firs that are growing on the Franciscans. And
yes,
in between, there's a mix point. And I'm wondering if any of those mix points have been studied. And similarly, you get deposits down things like School Section Creek, where there's just a big pile of ultramafic rock, and growing out of it are another whole bunch of the plants that we normally only see up on the top of Red Mountain. And I'm wondering if anyone's looked down there to see what happens in these mixed forests where both kinds of rocks are just scrambled together from earthquakes, slide breaks, freezing on the mountain, like it's going on right now this winter.
I don't know the answer to that, but that's really, really cool. The I know the canyons that you're talking about, and that's really interesting stuff. I will say that I would love to go and check that out, because that is a special place. Red Mountain near Leggett is a very, very cool place, and really worth a field trip. I've led field trips there before. I haven't been there for years at this point, but this is one of the things that you'll see where your bedrock geology map, you'll look at your geology map and it says, this is, I don't know, it's sitting on a basalt or it's on a sedimentary rock. And you'll think, well, what's going on here? I mean, there's serpentine endemics here and they can't grow anything. And you realize, like you said, the hillside above it is all ultramafics and it's just dry gravel, or during rainstorms, it's washing down onto the other soil. And even though the bedrock geology tells you you're not on ultramafics, really that's what's going on, is it's affecting it from the side. Anyway, that's really cool. I'll have to go check that out.
Come on up and show you where.
All right. So I think L'Oreal was the next hand that I'm seeing.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Great. I just wanted to, I heard you say something about the peridotite being the red that we see in serpentine soils. Did I get that right?
Yeah. So, well, I'm generalizing. So when you look at a peridotite outcrop versus a serpentinite, and usually they're mixed a little bit. And in fact, most of the peridotite that you see is going to be what we would call partially serpentinized peridotite. Okay. So in other words, it's peridotite, but it has had some level of alteration because it's been sitting underground for 10 million years or 30 million years, you know what I mean? Or 100 million years or something. So it's had some alteration. But the sort of the purest form of peridotite, that will form a laterite. If you have enough rain, it'll form a really deep, thick, red rocky, but also clay-filled soil. And you want to see that, go to the Josephine ophiolite. Wow. Or the top of Red Mountain by Leggett has the same stuff. But you'll just see just really, really dark red soils everywhere. Now, if you get an outcrop that's just serpentinite and the whole outcrop has been turned into serpentinite, it generally will generate sort of a grayish or even bluish soil. You can find the two of them together, but that's because they exist together. I'm not saying that you would never see a red soil on a serpentinite outcrop because it also has a lot of iron. It's just that by the time you get to serpentinite, a lot of that iron has been weathered out and it's been turned into other minerals that, anyway, does that make sense? I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, I think so. So if I see I'm hiking in a serpentine or ultramafic area and I see a pile of blue gray rocks that I know are serpentinite, that's serpentinite, but down the trail when it's more red and a little more gravelly, that's a slightly different version, different metamorphic action happening.
Well, it's probably a peridotite, and a peridotite's not a
Okay.
metamorphic rock, although what you're looking at has been metamorphosed probably a little bit. The main difference you'll notice in California is usually peridotite will form like blocks and small cliffs, and there'll be rocks sitting around. Whereas a lot of times the ultramafic rock it's physically a lot weaker, and it's often it can be crushed or just I'm generalizing again, but yeah, that's generally the case.
And they're all considered serpentine soils, but with just they're different rock types within the soils.
That's correct. Oh, and there are a lot of other kinds too. I mean, like when I use the word peridotite, there are lots of kinds of peridotites. You know what I mean? And there are various kinds of serpentinites as well. I'm just using those terms in a very general sense.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay, I see Galina.
Hi, sorry, I need to be quiet. I'm in the library, but I was
Okay.
wondering is with the taxa that you were showing, like with the plants, is they all seemed to be like vascular plants. Is there a tie with like non-vascular plants, like lichens with the biological soil crusts that we see in different parts of the state? Does that have anything to do with the serpentine soils?
You know, there's been very little work done on cryptogams and non-vascular plants. Depends where you are. I know some people have found mosses that seem to be more or less endemic to serpentine soils. The other thing I found is mycorrhizal associations. I know people in Europe in particular have worked on that a lot, and that the taxa of mycorrhizal fungi are quite different on ultramafic soils as well. But I don't know a whole lot about the lichen thing. You can Google it. I bet you if you did a Google Scholar thing, if there was anything, you'd find it. Right. But I don't know what to say about that. I will say that I think it depends on what we're talking about though, but I think a lot of lichens, aren't they really getting almost all of their nutrients out of the air?
Yeah, they are, most of it. They're not really like embedded in the soil.
Right. So that's why I've thought that I've just kind of reasoned to myself that, I wouldn't expect there to be a whole lot of endemism, but I don't know that. Well, anyway, if you find anything out, let me know.
Absolutely, thank you.
Yeah.
So it looks like there's a couple questions in the chat that we haven't gotten to yet. One is,
Okay.
why are there lower rates of endemic species in Sierra Nevada serpentine?
All right, I wondered if somebody would ask that. So there are a bunch of reasons, and Susan Harrison and I wrote quite a number of papers on the general subject of like the distribution and numbers of endemics on California serpentine soils and why they seem to change from one region to the other. And the Sierra Nevada are kind of an interesting case. One is that most of the serpentine, first of all, in the Sierra Nevada is found in the northern half of the range. There's a little bit in the south, but most of it's in the north. If you know anything about California geology, you might remember, or you might know, that all of that northern half or 2/3 of the Sierra Nevada was all covered in lava at one point. And then as it was uplifted, starting in the late Pliocene, the range has only been uplifted in the last 2 to 5 million years, right? In terms of its current modern form. Before that, it was covered in a thick pile of volcanics. And then as the range sort of rose up like a door on a hinge, and then the east side is over here and the west back here. And those volcanics are left now sort of on the plateaus between the river canyons, but otherwise they've all eroded off. But because of that, most of the ultramafics in the Sierra Nevada actually haven't been open to the air for all that long. You know what I mean? It's been, you know, maybe 1 million years, maybe 500,000 years, maybe a couple million years. Whereas if you go to the Klamath and the North Coast, they didn't have that huge outpouring of volcanic rock for the most part. And so there are places there where the rocks have been open to the surface to colonization and adaptation and all that stuff for many, many millions of years. That's one of them. A second one is that the Sierra Nevada is downwind of the Central Valley. And the Central Valley is a huge source of aerial emissions, nitrogen and sulfur and you name it, right? All the stuff coming in on the wind. And so the soil's being amended constantly with all that stuff coming from all the fertilization that's being poured in the Central Valley. That stuff is not landing on the Klamath. Another one is that because of the huge Sierra Nevada batholith, which is the, you know, that huge area of granitic rock, there always was and still is a lot of hot spring activity in and around the Sierra Nevada. And so hydrothermal alteration has happened to a lot of these areas as well. So those were three of the reasons that we think drive it primarily. One, that the rock bodies that are serpentinite haven't been open to the air. They weren't, you know, they didn't have the volcanics eroded off the top of them until relatively recently. The soil is constantly being amended by nitrogen inputs from the Central Valley. And what was the other one? It's getting late. Anyway, yeah. And hydrothermal activity. Is there another one?
There was one last question in the chat, and that was someone's partner carves rocks into bowls, and he uses electric grinders, wears a full face mask, and is wondering if those types of rocks simply shouldn't be worked, carved, chiseled. You have thoughts on that?
Yeah. Wow. Well, people have certainly always carved soapstone, right? I mean, and that's an ultramafic rock, but there's usually no asbestos associated with it. The softer serpentinite rocks, they'll very often have some level of asbestos in them. But like I said, it's usually chrysotile asbestos, which really isn't, strictly speaking, a health risk, at least not based on everything I know and I've read. So I would say one would want to be cautious. There's probably literature out there as to, you know, what the level of danger is and, you know, where did your rock come from and how likely is it to contain asbestos. I can say it's a beautiful rock and it would be an amazing thing to work with. So, you know, that's not the you know, the realm of, that's not within my realm of expertise. So I'm loath to provide you an answer, but I would say I would think you would want to be careful.
On behalf of Friends of the Lost Coast and the Bureau of Land Management King Range National Conservation Area, thank you for tuning in to Lost Coast Lectures. To view the complete archive of recordings from this series, or to learn more about our work inspiring a passion for nature, visit Friends of the Lost Coast online at lostcoast.org.